welcome to the next of our videos looking at aspects of principled negotiation. And in this short film we will be looking at the third of the fourth main elements of principled negotiation, which is using objective criteria. Using objective criteria is a notion that again is about trying to take the negotiation away from a battle of wills, away from a mere contest between two opponents pushing and pulling at one another, as it were, figuratively across the table. And it's using, if you like, triangulation in order to try and get some sense of the objective value of a proposition, but also as a way of getting past deadlocks and impasse in the negotiation by reference to some external perspective or some process or protocol or rule that both parties will find acceptable and that meets rules of procedural and ultimately substantive fairness. From Sibelius, the current leader of the Harvard Negotiation Project, he describes what it's all about. It's about finding a mutually persuasive principle or rule on the basis of something that both parties can actually get behind and which avoids a destructive and distributive approach to the negotiation. It doesn't become a test of wills. And in Sibelius' view, he says this can be a genuinely game-changing, productive orientation. It takes some of the dyadic pressure away from the negotiation. And this idea of referring to objective criteria, as we'll see in the examples that will come to follow, it can apply both in terms of the how of the negotiation and the what. In other words, setting the rules of the game, the process, and about the substantive outcome as to what is a just result, a just resting point for a particular aspect of the negotiation, or indeed the main subject matter. So just to give a very simple example, all of us have had the dilemma of perhaps wondering who goes first in a particular game. It could be who speaks first, it could be who presents first, it could be who gets the first turn at something. And very often, a consensual way of resolving such dilemmas is simply to toss a coin. And this is a very simple example of a reference to objective criteria. As long as the coin isn't loaded, both parties agree that that is a good way of deciding in a neutral fashion actually how we get past this particular question mark in the negotiation process. And from childhood, you may well have experienced this with friends or family yourself, when one cake is on offer or one slice of some sort of goodies, and one of the kids is told, well, one of you gets to cut it and the other one gets to pick first. And if you ever want to see children wrestling on the horns of a dilemma, I suggest you set up this little experiment in, again, objective criteria, both on the process of how we cut the cake and on the ultimate substantive result of this very simple distributive negotiation. So just some examples now to illustrate the point, and these kind of mix up both substantive and procedural aspects of the search and use of search for and use of objective criteria. Let's imagine the workers come in and demand a 15% uplift in their pay. The response should not be to say yes or no. The skilled negotiator says, tell me more. How did you arrive at that figure? And this is the beginning of a search for objective criteria, where we find, is this merely a positional stance that's been taken for the sake of, if we start at 15 we might settle on 7, or is this actually with reference to some other tabulation, some other calculation that has been done elsewhere to justify the figure that has been arrived at? And here is somebody saying, well, if you're not able to meet me, then I'm afraid I'm going to quit. And again, the skilled negotiator doesn't panic in response to that. You could argue this is an emotional attack, and as such you should not give in to it. What you should do is explore it. Label it, mark it for what it is, and again there's a form of objectifying in doing that. If it is an ultimatum, then we'll see whether somebody's serious. We can explore the consequences. But remember, negotiation is about what is agreeable to both parties. So what about suggesting then there's something is found that meets the criterion of being workable for both parties in the negotiation, reminding perhaps the first party that it is indeed a mutual problem that needs to be solved in the interests of both. Unfortunately, some students don't get through first time, and what happens when they fail? Sometimes they feel it's not their fault, they've been failed somehow by the institution. Again, that's a valid position if they want to hold it. What should our response be though? Well, again, objective criteria might help us out here. What are the regulations when it comes to looking at failed essays? And then, specifically back to the substantive performance of the student, how did you actually measure against the assessment criteria? Again, taking the heat out of simply a dyadic back and forward of demands and defensive pushback. Back to the employment situation, Smith & Company gave their workers a 5% bonus. That's all very well for them. Again, the skilled negotiator doesn't need to feel threatened by that. They can take it for what it is. It's new information that's been shared. What you might want to know next, though, is why is the figure for Smith & Company's workers a valid comparison for whatever we are discussing between us ourselves today? Again, searching for objective criteria, what is it that makes that relevant to this discussion, is in itself a question about whether it's an objective criterion against which to compare whatever you're discussing. And when you meet deadlock, you might be stuck on something. It's recognised that in many formal negotiating procedures, there will be some sort of procedure for actually dealing with aspects of deadlock. And this could be when you refer to a third party, whether that is to somebody outside the organisation, an external expert, somebody in some sort of judging role or adjudicative role, where both parties agree, for example, to submit a point to a conciliation service or an arbitration service or something like that. Again, there may well be that triangulation in the process, and that allows us to get past the idea that it's simply about who shouts loudest between us in the room today. Some of the things you need in order to really successfully promote the idea of reference to objective criteria, well, you need to really have instilled in the room the idea that there is a problem-solving mentality shared between the parties. The parties need to be acting rationally. They need to be able to have appeals made to their rational sense, if you like. And both parties need to be able to be open-minded, to be receptive to new information, to think about new ways of solving problems, of thinking about the perspective of the other person, and being willing to move from where you are now in light of and on consideration of new ways of doing things, new suggestions, new proposals. And now you can imagine that that sounds easy, but is maybe harder to deliver in practice. And so this links into the other aspects of getting to yes, about being a leader in the room, about appealing to interests and exploring interests rather than positions, and about looking for options for mutual gain. This idea of appealing to objective criteria has been named by critics as naive, and it may well be that. However, that doesn't mean that it's wrong. If it takes effort and it takes leadership from one side to try and persuade the other of the merits of trying to seek something that both parties can get behind and see it again as both parties on the same side of the table, looking at the problem together and trying to solve it together, then that can reap rewards for all.